Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, wherever you are in the world. Thank you for joining us for this week's edition of the SMIE Consulting Midweek Roundup. It's Wednesday, January 3rd, 2024, the first edition of the Roundup for the new year. Thank you so much for joining me today as we get into a new year of questions related to international education and what our profession is doing, how it is changing, and how it can respond to the changes that are coming down the pike, from government regulations to new source markets to new trends in the industry. All of these are topics that are fair game for our midweek roundup. So we appreciate you being with us for this inaugural edition of the 2024 version of the midweek roundup. I hope you all had a pleasant holiday break, a chance to relax and recharge after a wild end to the 2023 calendar year on a lot of different levels. And we appreciate you being a part of the conversation today. For those that are new to the Roundup, each week we take the questions we ask in the Roundup from our newsletter that comes out on Mondays at typically 9 a.m. Eastern if you get the email version. If you get the LinkedIn version, that comes out about 8:30, about a half an hour early. And I'll be dropping the links to this week's edition, both the email version as well as the LinkedIn version, into the chat so that you have that in case you are looking to sign up if you're not already signed up. The link to our newsletter starts with our website, smieconsulting.org/subscribe. And on that site, on that particular page for subscribe, you're able to go down, drop your information on the subscribe button, and you'll get the email version, if you prefer that way of getting this information, in your inbox every Monday at 9 a.m. Eastern. If you prefer via LinkedIn, you can get that half an hour early. The link to this most recent edition from Monday this week's edition came out on Tuesday because of the new year. As no one was in the office on Monday, I hope. And that will show you a quick way to subscribe to that if you go to this week's edition of the newsletter. So the newsletter covers all things related to social media and international education, and oftentimes where those two topics intersect. And we talk about on Wednesday some of the key themes we see developing in the news stories for that week, and we cover those a little bit more in depth. You get the hot takes on Monday for each of those news stories, and then here on Wednesdays we go a little bit more in depth and share our perspective on how these new regulations that we're going to talk about here in a minute with USCIS might impact what we do in international ed and how we can take advantage of some of that on the marketing side, on the front end of the process. But we'll also take a look forward into 2024 as to what the future of international ed holds, given a lot of the change that is happening in our industry. And specifically, we'll look at Australia's new migration strategy today and see what the implications might be from those changes that they are imposing. So let's get right into it. The first question of the day: what do new USCIS regulations mean for international students? Now, for those of you who are new to the Midweek Roundup or new to international ed and you don't know necessarily what we're talking about here, with regard to these immigration regulations, there's 3 or 4 articles I'll be sharing in the chat. First of which is from the Pi News, our good friends there, talking about the updated policy guidance for international students. There's also an article coming out that shares some details from an organization called Boundless, understanding the new USCIS policy guidance for international students and companies. And that's one of the big new features in this policy guidance that we'll be sharing with you. And the final piece is from India, and we know how obsessed the India market is with employment-related news. And we'll talk about how these fit into the mix for international students in India, in one of the most post-study work obsessed markets on the planet. Students in India that are looking to come to the U.S. will see this news from USCIS interpretation of regulations and what those mean for them and their futures. And this is what we're talking about here today. Let's kind of run through what the policy guidance is. First up, the one that's grabbing the most headlines is that international students who are in STEM fields in particular that are applying for jobs out in the world after they are finished with their degrees through STEM OPT. They have up to 3 years, but they apply for initial year, then they can get extended for 2 more years. One of the benefits that has kind of been a little bit unclear in the past as to whether or not international students can work for startups. The startups typically are in the tech industry, in STEM-heavy fields. So this policy guidance now addresses that and their ability, international students' ability to work for startups as STEM students, STEM graduates. What the regulations do say that it is possible that that international students can work for startups as long as, and there are some caveats here, that they have obviously a well-established training plan, which is part of the STEM OPT extension, that the companies must be enrolled in E-Verify and provide compensation commensurate to that provided to similarly situated U.S. workers, among other requirements. So that is the new policy guidance. So it's allowing for international students to work for these tech companies, these startup companies that might not have all be well established and know that it's even an option to hire international students. They now, oftentimes these startups might have been former international students who are starting them. So hopefully they see the value, and this will be a very significant improvement in terms of allowing those employers to hire international students, because as long as they're in E-Verify and they provide the right compensation, then they should be good to go. So there's some other minor things that some colleagues have commented already on LinkedIn when this article got posted, when I put this article out yesterday, that with startups that are oftentimes flying by the seat of their pants, they might not be enrolled in E-Verify. They might not know what the proper compensation levels need to be. So what could go wrong, someone said. Thank you, Alan, for that comment. But the point is of these new rules as it relates to the ability for international graduates, F1 students who are in the STEM fields to apply for employment at startup companies, that those startup companies, if they're in E-Verify and provide appropriate levels of compensation equal to what U.S. Similarly situated U.S. workers would typically get, then they should be okay. So this is, and when I all of the time, anytime we pose one of these questions on the roundup, it's always with a view to, okay, how does this help us? How does this hurt us? How do we respond to the news? I think is part of it. Obviously, the most immediate impact is International Student Scholar Services offices need to be sharing this with their students to let them know, and all of them are already. We're aware that this was coming, so that they're already have this in their process of informing their current international students of what the changes in immigration regulations are, and in a positive way, this is certainly one of those. Now, one of the things that is in this language, one of the other requirements, it does say in the new guidance that international students, though they are technically not in a non-immigrant category, they still must. The clarification says they still must maintain their permanent residency abroad in their home country, wherever that is. But that does not prohibit them from applying for benefits that have permanent residency intentions. Now, it's the coexistence of these two. It's one of the great dichotomies of and challenges of understanding U.S. immigration regulations is how can F1 students stay in the United States to work and then still on their student visa, and then transition to an H-1B, which is a dual intent category, can be a worker visa where that does lead to permanent residency. But it does say that these F1 students, that even though they must maintain their permanent residency abroad, can apply for benefits that do or changes of status that do allow them to have eventually permanent residency. So it's a very complex web of legalese and immigration regulations, but the basic gist of it is F1 students are non-immigrant visas. H1 visas are dual intent visas. And for many in the industry, in the international ed side, working with students, we've lobbied, as the Biden administration has in 2 previous immigration bills, one that they introduced right after they took office as part of their larger Build Back Better bill that kind of got lost in the shuffle, didn't get approved, was to make F1 a dual intent category, allowing for international students not to have to prove a negative when they go for their visa interviews at U.S. consulates abroad. Prove a negative meaning that they don't plan to immigrate, even though it's legally possible for them to do that. They can't say that that's their intention when they go for their student visa interview. So one of the great roadblocks, frankly, to really opening the floodgates for international students to come to the United States. And when I've mentioned this conversation, this question of would F1 students being dual intent, when I asked this question to consular officers, the people who are on the front lines doing the visa interviews every day with prospective students, I asked, would that change the way you do things? And they said, to a person, they've all said it'd be a game changer, because it removes that hurdle if F1 now becomes dual intent, that the student doesn't have to show that they're going to return home when they're done with their program, done with their OPT, that they can have a thought in their head that, hey, I might want to stay in the U.S. and live and work and on a more semi-permanent basis. And that's okay. That's what we would want, we would hope, from a government that is encouraging the best and the brightest to come to our country. Yes, we don't want there to be brain drain in countries. There's a lot of other issues involved here. But the reality is our system is set up to prevent the best and the brightest and or not prevent necessarily, but put significant hurdles in their path if they're going to become permanent residents and eventually citizens here. But many still do it. And that's one of the great attractions of the United States, because of the quality of programs, because of the quality of life in the United States. It has attracted immigrants from around the world for years, including students who aren't technically immigrants when they come, but they can be eventually. So these regulations are a positive. And let's not forget the importance here. These are a positive if we're able to spin that, not spin, actually interpret that and translate that to prospective student audiences abroad. Now, this is where a lot of the disconnects happen on campuses. We know these regulations are intended to be for the current students that are in the United States now, that are on OPT or soon to be on OPT, that are STEM students that have that extra 2 years of work eligibility. That they want to know this because it immediately impacts their ability to find jobs at different kinds of companies than they might have initially been looking at. Where we often see the disconnects happening is saying, wow, this can be a benefit to us as an institution, to our country, if we start promoting this to prospective student audiences. We all have ComFlows that we send out to prospective students overseas. Hopefully there's a specific international student ComFlow at your institution. If not, that's to be something that you're working toward. I know we're working toward that at UNLV. But for us, when you think about the kinds of messages you send out, related to jobs after graduation and ROI, outcomes, all of those kinds of things that exist somewhere in your ComFlow. This is something that you can add into those ComFlows and message out separately on social and other platforms. Maybe have your career services director do something specifically about that. Interview them about this topic and what that means for them as they advise international students who are looking for jobs when they're done with their degree or in their final semester. So this is something that can and should be used on the prospective student side to recruit new students to your campuses. When you can say that you not only can come to the United States and, if you're in STEM fields, work up to 3 years per degree level, bachelor's, master's, doctorate. You can work 3 years after you finish each of those degrees if you're in a STEM field. But now to expand that to say you can work for startup companies in your field that might not ordinarily have been in the mix for potential employers for you as an international student before this ruling came out. or this new regulation or interpretation of the regulation came out. So this is an important step forward for international students. And one of the things we often forget, we can be good, even on our institutional campuses, we can be good about talking about our career services, what services they do for international students, what graduation rates are for international students, job placement rates, all of that. Hopefully you can get to that at some point with your institutions. But if you can add this to the mix, and say to your prospective students, if you know that they're in a STEM field and they may be looking to work after and take advantage of that 3 years of post-study work, if you can say to them not just what your office is doing, but what the United States is doing to enable them to be successful after they're done with their degrees here. This is a step forward in allowing and expanding the range of options that international students in STEM fields will have when they start looking for jobs, if they know that they can look at startups and then making sure those startups are enrolled in E-Verify and have the right levels of compensation, all that. Those are big ifs, but it can happen. But it's a marketing tool that we can and should be using. Not just a change in regulations that will impact our current students, which will be great, but it can and should be change how we market to prospective students who are thinking about outcomes, who are thinking about what am I going to do when I'm done with my degree? What kinds of jobs can I get? This opens a new range of possibilities for them. So why would you not want to tell future students about this opportunity? So this is what we talk about all the time in connecting the dots on campus, that it is not just the international student journey of enrollment management is getting them to your campus and making sure they get enrolled and arrive and register for classes, all of that, get their health insurance, all of those things that we know they have to do. It's about getting them through their entire time on your campus, through housing, through food service, through residence life, through student affairs, through career services, through student employment, through alumni office, all the way through that process. When you connect the dots about the international student experience and think about what is out there that can help improve their opportunities, like something like this regulation change that just came out, and then you put that back into the front end of your process. You do this through alumni videos, you do it with parent videos, you do it with your current student videos. Back all of that content up into your ComFlows, into your social media outreach, and share the good news, not just about your institution and about what the United States is doing and the benefits that international students have and how they can be fully exercised during their time as students. And that's the picture you want to paint in your future students' minds. What is the end goal for me? What is the potential reality for me when I'm done with my degree at your institution? The more you can do that and paint that picture, the full picture of what the experience will be like on your campus and in the United States for them, the better off you're going to be in having a chance to enroll that student. So please make sure you're connecting those dots from these new regulations that impact your current students about to graduate on STEM OPT now. Connect that experience, what that benefit will mean to them, to future students, because they want to hear that too, and their parents want to hear that too. So make sure you're connecting those dots. Now, question number 2, how will 2024 be different for international education? And this is a big one, obviously. We're talking about issues related to 2024. What's the news? What are the kind of the hot topics of the day? All of these end of year, beginning of year prediction models of what's going on. I'm going to share about three or four articles here as well. All of these articles share slightly different perspectives on what is happening, predictions, and some data-based predictions on what the future holds, not just in 2024 but beyond. And there's an article from the PI News, University Business, and another one from the PI on predictions. And I wanted to make sure that you had those 3 articles here. Now let's start first with this landscape of international education, a little bit more than just 2024. And one of the things we always talk about at SMIE Consulting when we talk about our 6 P's of strategic international enrollment management is the first P. And probably the most important P is perspective. Perspective of how you approach international enrollment on your campuses? What are the perspectives on campus in terms of where does international fit into the strategic plan of the university? How is it valued? What support do you have amongst campus leadership, senior leadership? But also more broadly, what's the landscape in the United States for international education? And then beyond, what's happening on a global scale? We don't exist and recruit international students in a vacuum. There is an incredibly competitive global market out there for internationally mobile students. Latest data from 2023, I think, shared that there was about 6.9 million students studying outside, about more than 6 million students today, this year, that are studying outside their home countries. Now, that doesn't mean they're all going to the US or Canada, Australia, New Zealand, China even. They are looking to go regionally, perhaps. If they're in Southeast Asia, they might be going to Singapore. They might be going to Kuala Lumpur. They might be going to Bangkok. They might be in Korea or Japan as for regional studies, or in the Middle East. Regional hubs have been popping up for years. But by 2030, Holon IQ is now predicting almost 9 million people will be studying outside their home country. That's almost 3 million more. That's a 50% increase in the number of students who will be studying outside their home country in just the next 6 years. So we're at 6 million now, going to be up to almost 9 million by the end of the decade. That's a 50% increase in the number of students who will be studying abroad. They can't all come to the United States. They're not all going to go to Australia, the UK, or Canada. They're going to be spreading around, and more countries will come onto the list of top receiving nations than we have currently. We see a lot of countries are trying to become regional hubs, not just global destinations for students. So the data is showing that we have seen a huge expansion in the number of students going abroad in the last 30 years. When I started in the business, I think there was about 2 million, 2.5 million maybe. This is 1993, that were studying outside their home country. The US had about 400,000 at that point, 500,000. So we had about a third of the total at that point, maybe a little less than 2 million. So we had about a third of the total then. We're down to less than 20% now of the global total. We have 1 million students now studying in the United States, but there are 6 million now that are studying outside their home country. So the pie has gotten incredibly larger. Our share of that pie has dropped as the pie has gotten bigger, but our numbers have consistently gone up, bar post 9/11 and during the pandemic. So our numbers are going only one direction, and that's up. They might not go up as quickly as some other countries, but there are other dynamics at play here. And the perspective piece that I'm talking about is knowing what's happening in the wider world, that the pie is getting a lot bigger, that the amount of money that's being spent, and this is actually the part of this pie article that I don't focus on, but it certainly is valuable to see, that right now, by 2025, Holon IQ, who also had the other data that we shared on numbers of students studying outside their home country, has said that by 2025, so in just a year now, the global expenditure on education will top it'd be $8 trillion in a year's time, and by the end of the decade, will reach $10 trillion by 2030. So just huge amounts of money that are spent on international education and education in general. So a great article from the pie, just painting that picture. But University Business takes an important look at some 3 ways international landscape is changing from a U.S. perspective. And that first one that they talk about, that I mentioned as well earlier, is that international students are looking elsewhere, not to the exclusion of the United States, but they have more options. That other countries, Australia, China, Canada, UK, have over the last decade had policies that were much more aggressive in terms of their countries' willingness to go out and recruit international students. That these other countries have developed policies that have encouraged, that universities have worked with their national governments to encourage international enrollments and processes to be made simpler and more transparent and more clear cut in terms of how students can go once they arrive on campus and arrive in country, and what the future might be for them after they're done with their studies. Like in the U.S., we have this dichotomy with non-immigrant students and workers, and how those are two different categories of visas. So that non-immigrant and immigrant, but other countries make that path much clearer. That in Canada, that we've talked extensively about how they sell themselves on, if you want to stay and work, you're more than welcome to, and we encourage that. We don't do that as well here in the U.S., and we suffer for it. Our numbers could boom if we made it much clearer pathway for international students, but we don't do that right now. The second piece is that there are cons to attending the United States, and cost being one of the most significant there. The gun-related violence in the United States and heightened contentious political climate are two issues that can also put students off. And how do we counter that? And every time there's a negative, there are ways to counter that. And there's countering that through pre-departure orientations, connecting with parents, and when it comes to costs, you can talk about the cost benefit of what the end result is, the return on investment, all those kind of things. But you have to have the data to hopefully back that up. And the third piece is how online education is changing the dynamics of what is possible for students in particular countries in terms of study, that maybe they won't be able to spend their full degree in 3 years or 4 years or 5 years to finish their degree in your country at your institution. Maybe they do their first year or two online and then transfer in. So all of these are ways that, and that's also a way to help reduce those costs, is if they're doing online education for a year or two, that reduces the total cost that they're going to have to pay, because they don't have the living expenses piece that they have to be responsible for. So a good piece there. The final is a prediction piece from the PI with analysis from some industry leaders from ETS, from Oxford International Education Group, and a couple other folks. Teradata also contributed to this, and they have make all of their predictions are well and good, but the reality is of where they all share similar themes is talking about that perspective, that to be truly successful in this day and age, universities need to have a global perspective on what's going on in the wider world, and what competitive benefits are of universities and countries are compared to us, so that we know how to counter that, or position yourself in a better way to, when you're talking to students who might be looking at Canada, or might be looking at China, or might be looking at Australia or the UK, you have information about where they are, but also where you are, and you can talk intelligently to prospective students, future students, about what the differences are in the United States that make it a better opportunity potentially than going somewhere else. So it's, again, connecting the dots on all these and having that kind of global perspective. Now, let's talk specifically, and our last question of the day is how or what are the details of Australia's new migration strategy? These have been floated around. There was a lot of predictions on that there were going to be caps introduced by the Australian government, and that has not yet been the case with what's been released so far. I would doubt that they would go that extreme. But the kinds of things that Australia has done, in my honest opinion, you look at what's happening. We've talked about Canada previously and the restrictions that they're putting in place. The kind of quality control that never has really existed is now the national government is starting to put in place in Canada. You see some of those things happening also in Australia. And I see Australia and Canada in very similar positions in terms of where their governments are, in terms of what the strategies are related to migration. Both countries need migrants to be to grow as countries. They rely on immigrants coming in for their economy, to take the jobs that to help their economies grow and sustain themselves. Both countries, Canada and Australia, they've had huge challenges with the vocational education sector in both countries. They're addressing that in Canada with their designated institutional framework that will root out some of the visa mills or the diploma mills that the Minister of Education or Immigration referred to them as, these kind of private for-profit vocational colleges in Canada that attract 90% or more of their students from India and just kind of churn them out and drop them into society after sucking them dry for their money. That is something that's being addressed in Canada. Australia is also looking to make similar changes for the vocational sector in their country by looking at, frankly, they're now calling it a visa prioritization as part of their latest migration strategy that will have introduce a new framework for processing student visas based on the risk level of institutions. So very similar to that designated institution framework that Canada is putting in. And these CRICOS, it's their acronym for their visa process, their education institutions, those providers have been allocated an evidence level of 1, 2, or 3, and immigration will use that ranking to prioritize applications, with level 1 providers benefiting from faster processing time. Higher risk providers, from the article, and in the migration strategy, the government wrote, higher risk providers will experience slower processing times as visa decision makers consider the integrity of a provider, as well as the individual student applicants. So very interesting steps that involves there for the visa prioritization. There are impacts, obviously, with this change in migration strategy at the government level to those international students currently enrolled down under at universities in Australia. And this is something that when you look at what are they talking about here? Why are they left in limbo? Because they're changing the maximum eligible age for international students to get a temporary graduate work visa, that's our equivalent of OPT, will be reduced from 50 to 35, so it can't be older. So is that ageist? They're reducing that age from 50 to 35. That the strategy is to build Australia's skilled workforce. Some international students are currently studying the skills in demand are furious because they're turning 36 after they graduate. So they'll be left out of that process. So that temporary graduate visa process is a challenge for some of these students. But the two biggest changes that will impact future students coming to Australia is that the post-study work visa is being cut by 2 years. So in some cases, the work visas are 5-year visas. They're being cut to 3. In other cases, they're 4-year visas being cut to 2. Then this is so for undergraduates, they have 4 years. Have had 4 years. They will only have 2 years. Master's students within selected disciplines typically had been 5 years. They'll only be able to do 3. So 2 and 3 years, respectively. So then this was sort of a pandemic era test to give them extended work rights, but those work rights are being reduced back to the 2 and 3 years, respectively, for bachelor's and master's degree candidates. The other is we talked about the impact this has had in Canada, that they've in terms of working hours for students during studies, they ended those uncapped work hours in Australia, back down to the 20 per week. And then the other is the English language requirement. They are introducing an increase from 6.0 from, let's see, make sure I get this right, that they, in early 2024, they're going to go up to 6.0 for student visas and up to 6.5 for temporary graduate visas. Those are going to be introduced here. And they're also going to be introducing a genuine student test that will incentivize applications from genuine students who wish to study at Australian universities or education providers rather than those whose priority is to work. And that's a new genuine student test that'll be introduced. So how they're going to figure that out, that's another question entirely. So the restrictions are being put in place in Australia. The restrictions are being put in place in Canada. You've seen restrictions being put in place in the UK with their the elimination of the dependent visas for non-PhD students, which the majority of those that come on with dependents are coming for master's degree students, and then they're bringing whole families with them. That has now ended as of January 1st. In the UK, they're also talking about potential restrictions to their graduate route, the 2-year post-study work visa that they have in the UK, which would be another huge restriction, and it will have impacts on future students' interest in the UK. And we'll have news stories about that in the coming week, I'm sure. So Australia's current policies are certainly not positive for international students that might have previously come to the U.S., to Australia. Similarly, we've seen that happen in Canada, seen that happen in the UK. So U.S. is taking some steps in the right direction to make it a little easier for post-study work opportunities for international students, particularly in the STEM fields. So important to keep that global perspective at all times, and that's what we do here on the Roundup and in our newsletter. So we appreciate you spending the time with us this week and making 2024 the most successful in your careers. So until next time, wish you the very best. Cheers.